This question's on intergenerational equity. The idea that we can leave behind promises and opportunities that are as good, if not better, for the next generation than the current. It feels like it's fundamentally under threat from the way our current economic system has been set up, particularly the way we've designed our property and economic incentives. Does the panel agree? And if so, what needs to change?
Joe?
Oh, crikey. Housing property is difficult, is very difficult. And it's a bit like technology. The genie's out of the bottle and we're not going back to the days where houses cost, 3 times average income. So if your objective is to own a house in inner Sydney or inner Melbourne and you do not have access to the bank of mum and dad, you are screwed. And I would change your objective. And that's unfortunate, but again, like one of those things, we can pretend that governments will continue to pretend that they're trying to change it, but no government actually wants house prices to fall. That would be quite a problem for all the voters who own houses, for them with all the voters who own houses. So it's a real tragedy. I think in terms of the incentives of equity, I think this country massively overtaxes. I'm already can't believe I'm saying this with 2 economists on the panel, but massively overtaxes wages, and and undertaxes assets and the income and assets. And you heard through that whole stage 3 tax cuts, there was a lot of class-based language around how they were tax cuts for the rich. But the truth is that the rich, the real rich, and I understand why someone making $200,000 or $300,000 a year seems rich to someone who's making $40,000 a year. But the truth is that the real rich in this country, they don't work for salaries. They earn income in 2 ways: on the increase in the valuation of their assets and on the income those assets throw off. And that income is taxed at a far lower rate than workers who are working for a wage. And I think that is a structural problem with the Australian tax system. Unfortunately, the bad news is that no government will seriously try and change it, because it's a great way to lose elections.
Because it's a suicide note, isn't it, to your election campaign? Jacqui Lambie, you're not quite running for Prime Minister, you're a crossbencher, so you can you've got a little more...
Oh, it's early, PK, it's just early. I've got a few more years left in here.
Can you declare your ambitions to run for Prime Minister here tonight? Do we need to get bold and look at changing the tax arrangements?
We need to do something about the tax arrangements, there's no doubt about that, but we also need to do something about the arrangements up here and down here, and I'll explain that quickly. Up here, we have public servants, senior public servants out there, and chiefs of our Defence Force are earning twice as much as the Prime Minister. So you tell me how you work that out. We've got universities out there that have gone into the red and they've all given themselves, those Vice-Chancellors have given themselves pay rises. That's what they're doing while their staff are screaming out for pay rises themselves. That's what we're looking at. And then we've got down here with these kids. These kids, once upon a time, could go and afford to play sport. Now, to play sport, you can be looking at, I think it was $750 that I heard an 11-year-old girl in Canberra was paying to play for soccer for 20 games this year. Where are those, what happens to those families who can't afford that? That's without the gear. That's without representing your state, which costs more. Once upon a time, you could go to a small business if you had one of your kids representing the state, and the small business will give you a small donation of $100 or $50. Well, small business can't afford to do that either. So I've got a big problem from down here. I believe that while those kids are in primary school, especially primary school, they should not be playing for sports, and the state government should be picking that up. But let's get the priorities right here, up the top here. Because when I'm seeing Vice-Chancellors that are failing to get their jobs done, are failing to get those kids back in those universities and are giving themselves pay rises, I have a problem with that.
So you have an issue with wage inequity?
I have an issue with wage inequity.
Inequity, that point that Joe made, though, because that's true. Assets, they make money, and then you give them to your kids, and then they keep making money, and it's intergenerational, right? That's the story. Whereas wage earners, it might be high, but that's it.
Yes, yeah. So. But like you said, it's like unless you've come from a rich family, those assets aren't being passed down. Let's be honest with you. And we certainly don't have that. We're not Sydney and Melbourne in Tasmania. We don't have a lot of rich parents down there. They're surviving. They're taking their money into aged care. so they can finish off comfortably. They don't have much left for their kids. So we do have a problem. We have a housing issue out there, and like you said, it's completely out of control. We have lost control out of that, and we need to do something about it, and we're still arguing about how and where we're building these houses. That's where we're at.
Ed Husic, do we need a fundamental shake-up conversation? I know you're not going to declare sort of a new tax policy tonight, but do you think that there's... Well, you know, you can, but I'm living in reality. To address this intergenerational...
Well, we just went through a pretty big tax change just over the last few months that attracted quite a bit of criticism in terms of reshaping stage 3, and that's on top of what we've done on multinational tax reform and superannuation reform as well. So I think we've got a lot, you know, on the books as we speak, and getting through all that. The intergenerational side, though, just addressing Aidan's point, is a serious one. I mean, we're looking at both short-term and long-term fixes on that. A lot of people have felt like they've been stuck with the same wage for way too long and never saw their wages move. And we were actually a government that said we want to see better, and wages are now growing way better than they have for years. They're promised, but compared to where they're at, doing better. They can always people will want to do better, and I get that. But for years we lived under Conservative governments that said wages would improve, and they did nothing about it, and they never actually changed. And we also wanted to make sure that we made other changes through the taxation arrangements just mentioned. I think the big thing is going to housing as well. It is complex, and I take on board Joe's point, because you're going to have a whole bunch of people once prices start to go down that get nervous about it. But one of the other big things to try and deal with affordability is to actually increase the number of homes. I see that in my part of the world in Western Sydney, and increasingly people will not be able to move into the city. They're moving further and further out west, and I've seen the edge of Sydney continue to move. But we are trying to address that housing affordability issue, because it's one of the big drivers on your point about intergenerational differences when it comes to housing. And I've got to say, I take on board the point about some people handing down houses from one generation to the next, but I'm from Western Sydney, I'm no magnate. So I don't see necessarily that does happen, but I do genuinely get concerned when I see the cost of homes in my part of the world where I've grown up and know how those prices have moved, and we do need to make a change on that, and we are trying to do it both for housing, in terms of housing affordability, and helping renters to actually buy their first home.
Aidan?
Which is a demand side.
What concerns you about this? Are you able to get into the property market?
So, look, for me, yes, we've been lucky. Me and my partner, I think, very lucky to have secure, well-paid jobs. But you know, when I look at my friends, my peers, other younger Australians, other younger Aussies, I feel for our plight. I don't think the rules as they currently stand, really go to solve the longer term issues. I don't think the system's sustainable, and I think something has to give at some point.
Yep. I'll tell you what has to give priorities, and it'll take a government that's got guts to do that. Do you know you young people are paying more tax than what we get out of our petroleum resources rent tax? We have some of the most high-rated resources in this country, and we're getting more out of you young people by tax than what we are out of mining and petroleum resource rent tax. It comes down to priority, and it comes down to having the guts, knowing very well you're not going to get a political donation off them next time. And that's what it comes down to. It's priority, and it should be about our young people, and you people are not being put first. And that's what it comes down to, and that's the truth of the matter.
So house prices are going to keep... Sorry.
Can I just add to that? Well said, Jacqui. Norway taxes the oil industry to subsidise university education, to make it free, and to subsidise social housing. Australia does exactly the opposite. And that is your responsibility as a government. And everything I've heard from you today on this issue is a cop-out. It is your responsibility to tax the resource industry, to make, just do away with HECS. It was a terrible reform by the ALP under the Dawkins reforms. It was a catastrophe for the universities. The quality of university education has suffered as a result. The buildings are much nicer because vice chancellors receive $1 million in order to be real estate developers, while their levels of university education are plummeting. Social housing. You talked about increasing the supply of housing. Absolutely. What are you doing about that? It's not going to increase on its own. You need to build social housing.
That's
it is
exactly
really
what we're doing.
and you're not doing it.
No, well, you can say we're not doing it, and that's fine to be living a life fact-free.
Well, are you doing it?
But the reality is that's exactly what we're pushing to do. Well, we've only just started as a new government.
I hope
They do have
hang on a second, we've gone from it isn't happening to it is, but it's not enough. Is that what you're arguing? Or?
Well, you haven't done it.
Yeah, well, there you
No,
go.
And where are you going to get the money from? Because you're not taxing the resources.
All right, let's go to money, because Stephanie, you're all about money. And
I am all about
I
money.
want to go to your modern monetary theory. Give me the elevator pitch of what that means.
It means we want to tell the truth about how the monetary system works. We want to be honest about the capacity of a currency issuing government, like the Australian government, the Japanese government, the British government, the US government, the Canadian government, and so forth and so on. And recognize that countries that operate with their own currency, that issue their own currency, do not and cannot operate their budgets like a household, that things simply work differently. And when you talk about governments needing to, quote unquote, find the money, it's as if we think we're still operating on a gold standard and somebody's got to go dig a hole in the ground and pull gold out in order to be able to spend money.
But the issue with going into more debt is inflation. That's the issue, isn't it?
Okay, but I didn't say anything about debt. So far, I'm just trying to have a candid conversation about where the money comes from. So let's understand that in the modern era, when the Australian government decides it wants to spend more, the instructions go to the Reserve Bank, and the only way the government can spend is for the Reserve Bank to change the numbers in the bank account so that the deposits increase and the money is created. It's not like there's some other way for it to work. There's only one way for this to work. Government says it wants to spend, the Reserve Bank carries out the payments on behalf of government, and it does so using nothing more than a computer keyboard, changes the numbers up in the bank accounts, new money is created. We can all take a deep breath knowing that the government can't run out of money, but it can run out of things to buy. So inflation is the thing you've got to worry about, not insolvency, not bankrupting your country. There is no national credit card. We need to have a grown-up conversation.
Okay. Joe, do we need to print more money?
Well, as Dr. Kelton just said, inflation is the thing we need to worry about, and printing more money causes inflation.
No, it doesn't.
Well, okay. Then I'm wrong.
Well, sure, because
It can.
I mean, spending, not printing. There's no other way for it to work. So I've just explained. There's only one way for the government to spend. Can the government spend too much? Yes, of course. We can have, in total, too much spending in the economy. The economy doesn't have the capacity maybe to keep up with all that demand, and you get some increase in prices, sure. But, we spent the better part of a decade before COVID with people saying governments were printing money. The US was printing money, Japan was printing money, and the UK was printing money, everybody was printing money, and there was no inflation. For a decade in the US, a decade across the Eurozone, 3 decades in Japan, printing, no inflation to show for it. So inflation finally showed up, not because anybody printed any money, but because COVID showed up and broke supply chains. And then the inflation was the natural consequence.
Okay.
Especially given after 15 years of zero investment in Europe and in the United, or very little investment in the United States. So supply had been constrained because we were not investing all this time.
But 100% of the inflation was not supply side.
No, but everyone who's looked at this, at least in the US context, but look at the ECB. Look at people who've done the autopsy, that go back and really do detailed analysis and say, where did this inflation come from that we've experienced over the course of the last 3 years or so? It came from the supply side. It came from the bottlenecks in production and later from the war in Ukraine and Russia. It came from energy and food prices. Very little. Look at the San Francisco Federal Reserve. Look at Moody's Analytics. Anybody who's done these analysis, the ECB will tell you, look, we haven't even talked about the price gouging. Corporations took advantage of the inflationary environment. They raised prices, so some of it came from there, but very little of the inflation, for those who've actually done the work and tried to explain it, will say that it came from governments just simply spending too much.
The RBA in Australia said that they modelled it in different ways, but between a third and a half of the inflation outbreak in Australia was demand side, not supply
As an
side.
economist, may I make a point?
Sure.
Look into these models. They are a little bit like sausages. If you know what's in them, you don't want to touch them.
You know,
Ed Husic on the big
I think
question.
he's used that one before. It still works well.
It's pretty good. But on inflation, price gouging, I mean, the government has been arguing that a lot of it is actually coming from the supply side as well, right?
Oh, there's been definitely an element of immediately post-COVID. There was certainly that. We've also looked at and had concerns, and again, I see it in my own community when people are going to supermarkets, shopping, what they're getting in the basket versus what they used to be able to get for the same amount of money, and it's why we've said we need to have an increased focus and had the ACCC looking at, for example, what's happening on that side, where it directly affects people in the street, as it were. So there are those areas. I think the difficulty in terms of what, I appreciate what Stephanie was saying. I think the issue will be that governments around the world, I think you appreciate, are concerned about where inflation's at. Still, some of it's moderating, not moving fast enough. We're seeing it stabilise here, and the issue will be just to see that fight end and see inflation come down.